Hello folks, this is David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer. And in today's video, I want to do some analysis of some analysis. The other day, I was watching this video by Caleb of the St. Louis Chess Club, taking us through a couple of games, the point of which was how it is better to understand your openings rather than simply try to remember a string of moves. And it's in the second game where he makes a comment in passing which caused me to raise my eyebrows. And this is the comment. I have sped up the video to 150%. There may be some feedback echo, but it gets us moving faster.
In the game, we started with d4, g6, the maybe modern defense, maybe kings and structures, whatever you want to call it. I went with c4, g7, knight c3, c5, d5. Now, a funny line is bishop takes c3, b takes c3. This is almost losing for black, but the white doesn't always do it.
There we are. That's the comment. This is almost losing for black. Now, this setup is familiar to anybody who knows anything about Charlie Storey and his book, The Sniper. So, having heard with some surprise that this setup is almost losing for black, I checked out what Charlie has to say about this specific setup. And he says that for bishop takes c3 check, I love this move. And then he goes into some detail about why, but also about some of the dangers that black can encounter in running with this line. So I will hop over to Lichess and analyze some of this content that Charlie offers. And also, I checked out what John Watson has to say in a strategic chess opening repertoire for white on page 248. He talks about the modern defense, and he actually recommends that white avoids the early knight to c3 move, even though that is a repertoire move, in order to avoid this situation that white now faces here. And so I will also do a little bit of analysis of that from the perspective of white, especially as I am a keen d4 opener, and it's quite possible if you open d4 that you'll end up in this kind of situation. And so let's look at the game on the Lichess board, starting d4, g6, c4, bishop to g7, the knight comes out to c3, and then we have the signature move of Charlie Storey's Sniper, the c5 move. This is usually followed by an advance of the d-pawn, and it's here where we get the characteristic move bishop takes c3 check, and then b takes c3. This is the point where Caleb said it's almost losing for black. And at this point, there are two moves that Charlie recommends in the Sniper. The f5 move, which is clearly the one that Lichess recommends, and another move which I think in the end Charlie doesn't favour so much as the early f5 move. I think further analysis shows that the f5 move is superior. However, the other move that we'll have a look at just now is the queen to a5 move. What is the purpose of it? It's threatening the c3 pawn and therefore threatening an early check against the king. The c3 pawn is undefended, so white responds by defending it with the queen. And then we see this signature f5 move here. Now, Lichess is recommending e4, which we will look at later. But this is actually a game that in the Sniper, it's page 151, 152, 153. It's a game played between I. Morovich and Fernandez G. Laco in Pula in 2000. And so these moves are not necessarily the recommended moves by Charlie. He's analysing what happens in this game. So, for example, this f3 move, as opposed to the immediate e4, leads white into a bit of difficulty because we have this series of moves here. this setup here, before we get into what happens, what causes white's difficulty, this setup here with the knight to d7 and knight to f6 are kind of signature moves for black in this setup with the pawn here on f5. Now, once this is where the difficulty begins for white. Once white decides to perhaps take advantage, apparently, of this diagonal here, everything mounted up here, the queen, the bishop, and the pawn, white takes the f5 pawn. This is followed by an advance of the knight to e5, attacking the d3 bishop. If white ignores that, as was the case in the game, and takes another pawn, we get knight takes a d3 check, queen takes knight, and probably what white was not expecting was, I wasn't expecting that, probably what white wasn't expecting was this move of the bishop to f5, an apparent bishop sacrifice. The bishop is pointing at the queen, but the queen could simply take the bishop. So what's the purpose of this bishop move? It is that if the queen is lured into the offer, then black's queen can take the c pawn, forking the king and the rook. So it is not the advisable move for white. It happens in this game. Perhaps he thinks he can get away with it. The queen comes in with the check, and white moves his king to f1, and down goes the rook. Black is given an advantage by Lichess. The queen comes back to defend the bishop on c1, allowing black to now take the pawn on f6. That does give the queen a chance to pop back up and take the pawn, and then come back down and defend the bishop, having checked the king. From here we have b5, and at this point Charlie's comment is that black is clearly better despite the early king adventure and should go on to win. Another point he makes is that playing the early queen, the early queen to a5, it prevents what he calls a dangerous g4 move. G4 here preventing or challenging the f5 square. But let's move on and see the next variation of the game. So let's continue by looking at what happens if white responds to the early queen to a5 with e4, letting the c3 pawn hang. What are we talking about? We're talking about this opening here, where after these moves, the queen moves out to a5, threatening the hanging c3 pawn. We just saw how the queen, white's queen, typically will try to defend this pawn. But what happens if white decides not to do that and simply and immediately advances the e4 pawn? Let's follow through a few moves of a game which Charlie is analysing, played in Tehran in 2007 between E. Gayem and Maghami O. Anil Kumar. So here, if the queen takes that pawn, we have the bishop hopping up to d7, forcing the queen away. And in the game, the queen went up to g7. And Charlie comments about the cheeky pawn capture, as he calls it, this capture of the pawn by the queen. This cheeky pawn capture is somewhat brave, as the bishop on c1 will look forward to a happy life on this diagonal here eventually, the a1 h8 diagonal. And his comment is that in this game, a 2,200 rated player draws against White, who is a 2,550 rated grandmaster. But even so, Charlie doesn't feel comfortable recommending this variation. There is a suggested alternative to sending the queen straight up to g7, which is that the queen instead hop over to, where are we? That the queen hop over to a3. That the queen hop over to a3. That the queen hop over to a3. We then have this series of moves here. The knight moves forward, the queen hops up. The knight is now advancing up to b5. The queen returns all the way home from her adventure. The queen hops out to a4. And Lichess is recommending that the bishop to d7 to pin the knight to the queen. Charlie comments about, Charlie recommends this move, or follows through with this move, and then comments that in this variation, the queen to a3 move, the queen is fighting to prevent the bishop easily moving up here by hanging around in this corner of the board. So the queen on a3 tries to fight against White's queen side and hinder the bishop's occupation of the long diagonal. But after this move, White has adequate compensation for the loss of that c3 pawn. And in fact, after the series of moves we've just looked at, White reaches an unbalanced but level position. So Black has no obvious weaknesses, he says, but White should be able to create an imbalance in the near future due to his good lead in development and the advanced position of the knight on b5. So Charlie sees this as advantageous for White, as in fact does Lichess. So in conclusion, it seems that Charlie does not want to recommend a5, but rather the early queen to a5 move, but rather prefers the early f5 move, which is the same conclusion that we've come to looking at Lichess's recommended early move as well. So let's now have a look at those early f5 variations. So instead of the queen coming out here to a5, which we've been looking at, where the queen attacks the undefended c3 pawn, let's instead see what happens when Black plays the early f5, which is the recommended move by both Lichess and Charlie. By playing f5, contesting control, Black is contesting for control of the e4 square in the center. One typical response by White is to counterattack on the H file like so. If Black brings out his knight, White can continue the advance, hoping to break up this pawn structure here. Lichess is recommending rook to g8, but let's continue with Charlie's analysis here. In the case where the knight takes the pawn, what happens if the rook takes the knight with the aim of breaking up this pawn structure? Let's have a look down here. So the pawn structure is broken up, and then we have the e4 move challenging for the center. However, with this the queen to b6, it leads to an advantage for Black if there is this exchange of queens over here. Black gets in that nice d6 move, strengthening or creating the pawn chain, and then strengthening further the pawn structure. And Charlie's comment here is that this is a very nice game for Black, and in fact you can see that this series of moves brings an advantage for Black according to Lichess as well. That's the early, in the case where the rook takes the knight, and this particular chain of moves is followed through on. However, that things do not always play out in this way. what happens if you take the knight takes the h5 pawn, hoping for the sacrifice of the rook for the knight, but instead white plays an early e4. Well, we have another variation where indeed the queen hops out to a5, and then we get this exchange here. Here we see the bishop forcing the queen away, hoping to gain control of the a1, h8 diagonal. But if the queen just hops up to here, checking the king, the bishop defends. We get the d6 move in, rook to b1, and things are beginning to look a bit sticky here for black, according to Lichess. This is a possible Lichess refutation of the early f4 line with this knight takes h5 variation. I just want to take you through another variation that I quickly played through, where the knight takes and we get the early e4 move in here. So if you just come back, knight takes h5. Just come back a little bit more so you can see what's happening. The knight comes up, the h-pawn advances, knight takes h5, and then what if there is this early e4 move, and if instead of moving the queen to a5, why doesn't black just take the e4 pawn? Well, this is what Lichess gives us if black does do that. If I can find it. Where's it gone? Oh, f takes e4. Here we go. F takes e4. You see that there is an immediate jump in white's advantage. Black gobbles up the pawn, and now the rook can happily take h5. And here's why: when black retakes, it's losing for black because the queen comes in, bang, with a nasty check, and the king is forced to move out. Now the bishop comes in, checking again. The king comes over to g8. The bishop moves out. There's a desperate advance of the e-pawn. The queen takes that. It's checkmate. Could be checkmate next go if white is not careful. However, it is a forced checkmate coming because of these moves here. Checkmate. Goodbye to black on the 15th move. So you have to go a bit careful when you're attacking e4 from f5 in this setup if white has advanced that h-pawn. So that being said, what other options does black have? Where did we get to? We looked at the h5. Let's look at something else. Let's look at what happens if we get this early g4, which we mentioned before, where white challenges this f5 pawn. Now, this move has not been referenced at all by Lichess, so I can't really comment on what Lichess thinks about it. It seems that Lichess thinks nothing about it. We then get an early queen to a5, queen to c2 to protect that c3 pawn, d6, rook to b1, knight to d7, rook hops up to b5, queen to a6. Now we get this series of takes. The queen comes up. There's this nice little exchange here where if the queen hops up and takes the f5 pawn, the king looks a bit vulnerable, but there is a response, and it is that the queen takes a2. Black is here maintaining a small advantage. What happens if, instead of the recommended return of the queen to perhaps swap off queens, there is this move here, e3, the knight comes in, the queen checks the king moves over, and then we have a challenge for a queen swap off, not accepted. The queen hops down here, challenging, so the hanging bishop is not taken right now because there'll be a reply down here. Now, by bringing, so this is an interesting point where in Charlie's play out of this variation, he has the white rook take the hanging b7 pawn, and that is followed by a comfortable capture of the c3 pawn by black. Sorry. And Charlie says from here, it's a nice game, a comfortable game for black. However, Lichess's recommended move is not to touch that hanging pawn up there, but in fact to bring the rook back down here and defend that pawn, or block that pawn. And the rook itself is nicely defended by the bishop and the queen. The king's tucked in behind this bishop here. So let's now look briefly at what John Watson recommends from White's perspective, opening with d4 when confronted by the g6 opening. Now, John Watson, in his book, A Strategic Chess Repertoire for White, offers the basic opening repertoire, the first three moves for White being d4, c4, and knight to c3. However, there are certain cases where the repertoire needs to be set aside to some extent to deal with how black responds to the opening one or two moves. And in this case, we get the first two moves of that repertoire, d4, c4. But once the bishop moves out to g7, both John Watson and Lichess recommend switching away from the third signature move of that repertoire, knight to c3, and going for e4 instead. If we just look quickly at the c3 option that we've been studying, where we get this opening here, where the bishop takes and then White takes back. If you remember, Caleb said that this is almost losing for black. And John Watson's comment is that his recommended alternative third move of e4 avoids this scenario. And he says it avoids the whole scenario, although I believe that this is ultimately a poor variation. So he too is very skeptical, or is skeptical about this variation for black. He's skeptical of black's chances. However, he doesn't want to lead the reader into the complexities that come out of this variation. And so what he recommends is the third move, avoid it altogether by heading for e4. And then from that, he anticipates black's next move to be d6. This could be what Charlie would call a deferred sniper, where you save your c5 move for later. And then after that, he allows the move of the knight here. But then from here, his analysis heads more into other styles of opening, the King's Indian and stuff like that. He also refers back to Benoni type situations for dealing with this kind of opening on black's side. So he's pretty much setting aside the sniperish stuff that we've been looking at and guiding us towards this setup here, assuming that black is going to play in a more traditional way, perhaps. However, let's imagine that our opponent was a sniper advocate. And so what is likely to happen if we see this opening set up here is that that person will have read Charlie's chapter 6, the 6th chapter, in which we have this kind of setup. I don't know if you can see there. Is it that page or is it this page? Yeah, there it is. There, where is it? Where we have three pawns in the center. White does this big center, and Charlie recommends the pure sniper, in which we get c5 coming straight in, and here we have d5, and from here Charlie recommends d6, and then, well, we'll go with our repertoire here. Are we inviting? We are inviting this move, but Charlie's next move is to create what he calls the Bermuda Triangle setup. So he's only interested in the bishop takes knight, which he calls the broken arrow, by the way, if the e4 move hasn't come in. So if it's this series of moves here without these two here. So there we are. That's the way Charlie would deal with a John Watson style response to g6 and bishop to g7. I don't have any information on this particular structure from John Watson. This is where, playing from White's perspective, more study will be required. So anyway, that's just some thoughts I've been having about after seeing Caleb and hearing his comments over here about this setup being almost losing for black. I think in retrospect, I can see what he's getting at. I take on board John Watson's skepticism. However, I've got a lot of respect for Charlie's ability playing this system. It seems to take a lot of precise play. I mean, Charlie is one of the top players in Britain when it comes to blitz using this sniper, playing as black. So there we are. I'm not sure it's something I'd recommend for the easy chess tips seeker, as there's a lot of complexity and a lot of dangers built in it. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. And so I hope it's given you some food for thought and will give you an inspiration to do some further study on this modern opening, the possibilities and the dangers that you can face with that early bishop takes knight on c3 move. That's all from me for now. David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com, your pub chess bluffer, signing out.